Berea was founded by a group of ardent abolitionists and radical reformers, led by John and Matilda Fee, who came here to really create, in my understanding and view, the Gospels right here on this planet. And they set out to create a rather utopian community grounded in the notion of impartial love that would achieve a level of equality the South had not heretofore seen.
Between 1858 and 1892, before Frost got here, you had more African-American students than white students, except for maybe 1 year during that time period. So the focus was on educating blacks and whites.
So in these early years of Berea College, we see the founding of the labor program in 1859, where students could work for the college in some way to help offset the cost of some or all of their tuition. And then in 1883, student industries was added to this labor program, where students could create or work and labor in various industries, like at a brick-making factory, at a dairy, a creamery. And then these industries were a way for the college to cooperate and connect and serve the local community, but also later opened avenues to connect with areas outside of the Appalachian region.
Appalachia didn't really get to be invented at a wholesale level until beginning about the 1880s. So like many places around the world and many peoples around the world, Appalachia and people from Appalachia were a construction. It was an invention, a creation, a bounding, a defining, and a creating of a region and a people. So the region became known as Appalachia. The people were named and identified just alongside the region for specific purposes. There is a function that Appalachia came to serve for this country, taking a place that was always inhabited by a triracial society of Africans, Europeans, and indigenous people. Taking that region, renaming it. William Goodell Frost, who became the president in 1893, the last year that black students outnumbered white students, amid a rising tide of segregation throughout this country, wrote an article in The Atlantic called people there our contemporary ancestors. Just think about that, our contemporary ancestors. And those ancestors in this new formulation, this new invention, this new construction, were white. Berea was no longer just a predominantly white institution after 1908, when the Supreme Court sided with the state of Kentucky in its ruling about interracial education. It was, by state law, an all-white institution. That was a tremendous breach.
So between trends during the Frost presidency and the forced segregation of Berea by the state, Berea ended up tragically diverging from its founding mission of racial equality. And in turn, Frost then started marketing Appalachian craft as a way to promote the institution to white Protestants, primarily outside of the Appalachian region. And he thought this would be a way for students and local families to support themselves and help get the mission and word of Berea College out into the world. And so he and his wife Eleanor ended up directly involved in creating a craft program and bringing these local traditions sort of back into the light.
In 1901, Eleanor Frost visited the home. They spent a couple of days, talked about weaving, got all the dyes and drafts and things like that, came back to Berea. So that was the first visit with Miss Frost, which was first of many. And she started weaving and selling weaving for the college. So, and then in 1905, the whole family, Kit Kat and Caboodle, moved to Berea. The story says she took some linseed, gave it to Nellie for part of her tuition, because that's what the college was doing at the time. They were advertising and saying, send your children, this is the money they would need to bring, and we will buy homespun from you. As far as the coverlets go, they were much more in demand. But at this time, she wasn't weaving that, and I'll read this for you. He says, she had never woven anything except plain weaves. She had from her mother-in-law some faded brown strips of paper with figures on them, which she'd been told were drafts for threading up a loom for pattern weaving. She did not know what the figures meant, and nobody in the community knew, but the coverlets were worth $5 apiece, and she must weave them. Horseback, she rode to visit other weavers. She found a great many old drafts, which she copied carefully, but no one seemed to know how to use them. At last, she and a neighbor woman decided to experiment until they discovered how to use a pattern in threading on a loom. They succeeded. Only those who've had experiences with looms realize what this success meant. So they took these old drafts, figured them out, put them on a loom, and then wove coverlets like the one that we've got here. The college campaign was get those old looms out of the barn, trying to get people now or then to go back and do what their ancestors had been weaving.
The first designs that we end up having come out of the craft program in its earliest days were conceptual, but this concept wasn't an authentic Appalachia. This concept was an exoticized Appalachia, a romanticized Appalachia. An Appalachia that ignores the contributions of the Black and Indigenous people of the region while still misrepresenting the white Appalachia that it claimed to be.
That perfectly encapsulates the commodification of Appalachian material culture that was remade and constantly being remade to satisfy the demands of consumers who wanted to own a piece of tradition as a commodity. And so Wallace Nutting, it's really quite easy to understand why he would have been taken so much with Berea's mission and with Frost's work and concentration on craft in Appalachia during this time, because it was another manifestation of the nostalgia and the fear about the present and the future, and the ascendancy of segregation in this country that made whiteness so appealing. There were no people of color in those Wallace Nutting drawings. None. The Windsor chairs were meant to be sat in and consumed in the homes of white people.
Going back during that time period, now I can understand, not to condone or endorse what Frost did, but during that time period, Black culture was not valued. Up until the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, what do you mean by nostalgia? When you talk about the good old days, what are the good old days? Are the good old days when my parents couldn't go into a restaurant and sit at a lunch counter and eat? Or the good old days when we elected our first African-American president and broke a trend that had been established since the founding of our country? So what are the good old days? What the good old days are good for some, but not good for most.
In 1950, Berea started the process of reintegrating, and in the years following that, a few people saw an opportunity in student craft to be something more than rote production. And some of these people were Wood Turner, Rudy Osolnik, Oster Strobel, who led weaving for a time, and Wally Heilig, who started the ceramics apprenticeship program.
The apprenticeship program exists as a holistic experience. And if I break up all of those assignments, I know very well that we could be way more efficient, but I would not be helping the student to become a whole person who saw any kind of enterprise from beginning to end, and the impact of the beginning on the end, or the impact of the middle on the beginning and the end, and avoiding that tendency to break up the labor experiences into discrete categories based on efficiency and skill was just the complete opposite. It was turning them into common laborers rather than helping them to find the love of a certain activity and explore that activity in its entirety, and then find out how much of that activity they really liked, how much of it they would sustain them as productive citizens as they went on in life, regardless of what discipline it was. What I have seen is change and evolution. And as I reflect back in terms of the day one of my interview, I saw, wow, a big space, it's chaotic, it's potential. And if they let me make changes, something might happen here. And that is exactly what ultimately I think I am seeing is the potential is still there. The Berea is still made up of many of the elements that were there during my early years, and it is being energized by people who are willing to make change.
You know, my family since 1896 has been associated with Berea College and many changes and generations. So I'm kind of maybe not the best person to, or maybe I am, because I'm still a huge believer in the Berea College mission and how it's changed.
Now in Student Craft, we look towards the college's founding mission to inform our curriculum. And as of the fall 2023 semester, 93% of the objects we produce were either entirely designed by students or designed with a lot of student input. In this way, we're able to authentically tell student stories because the students are the ones telling them.
You know, fast forward to where we're at now, I believe that, you know, we're doing a much better job. We're more enlightened and in touch with the times and understand the importance of diversity. Not only diversity as relates to the number of students that we have, but diversity in craft and what we create, and that every person, no matter where you come from, has a story to say through craft. Students now have more of a voice and their culture is represented, whether they're from Kenya or from Harlan County. There's value in what they produce in the craft department.